Konnichiwa minasan, namaskar and welcome to the class in the second lecture series on Introduction to Japanese Language and Culture. So, in our previous class we did particle de and how to use particle de in different ways and make our conversation better. There are many other ways you can use particle de, which I will not do today of course, I will do it later. Today I want to do something else with you which is quite interesting also. I want to do some restaurant expressions. When you go to a restaurant, what does the waiter say to you? How does he take your order? What should be your response when you order food? So, all those polite and honorific and humble expressions we are going to do today. But before that, as we always do, I want you to listen to this conversation because that will make your hearing also very strong. There are a lot of expressions that you might have heard. They may be a little familiar to you, some may not be familiar, some may be absolutely new. So, let us see what we have here for you and listen to the conversation.
いらっしゃいませ。何名様ですか
4人です。
こちらへどうぞ。お待たせしました。お飲み物はいかがですか
とりあえず紅茶とレモンティー2つずつお願いします。
わかりました。すぐお持ちします。紅茶とレモンティーをどうぞ。ご注文はお決まりですか
おすすめは何ですか
今日のスペシャルメニューにチキンカレーとエビパスタです。
じゃあエビパスタ3つとチキンカレー1つお願いします。カレーにライスはついてますね。
かしこまりました。確認します。エビパスタ3つとチキンカレー1つですね。
そうです。何分ぐらいかかりますか
少々お待ちください。20分ぐらいです。
大丈夫です。
お待たせしました。チキンカレーとエビパスタ、どうぞごゆっくり召し上がってください。
すいません。お会計お願いします。
どうもありがとうございました。またいらしてください。
So, you just heard the conversation and as I said, you would be familiar with a few expressions that have been used here. For example, look at the kaiwa here. いらっしゃいませ。何名様ですか? So, いらっしゃいませ is an expression which is used generally at shops or restaurants or supermarkets or places like this where you enter some place and somebody welcomes you. Basically, it means welcome. So, generally in Japan you will have somebody standing near the main entrance, some girl will be standing or some person will be standing and they will welcome you by saying irashai mase. Now, if someone comes to your house, generally you would not say irashai mase. You would say welcome, dozo irashite kudasai. So, expressions of welcome for shops and restaurants and malls is different from what you would use at home. Now, namme sama desu ka? Now, this is the first thing that a person inside the restaurant, the waiter probably, would say namme sama. Mei over here I will do later also, but mei is for counting. Namme sama. Sama is polite for son. Then yonin desu. So, he gives the counting, the number and he says yo nin. Nin, as we have done earlier, is the counter for people. And what does the person who is in the shop says, or employee of the shop or the waiter over there says kochira e dozo. Now, kochira is a polite word for koko, for place. Kochira e dozo, please come this way. Dozo. So, giving permission to follow him. And then after 5 minutes, omatase shimashita. Now, o as you know is honorific like in o namae. So, omatase shimashita. Sorry to have kept you waiting. Again, o nomimono. You have done this nomimono, you have done the kanji also for nomimono, something to drink. So, when you are talking to your customer, you do not know the person, then what is the honorific that you are going to put over here? That is o, as you saw with omatase shimashita. Nomimono wa ikaga desu ka? Ikaga is polite for dou desu ka? So, Rao-san says, toriaizu, first and foremost, first of all, kocha to lemon tea, futatsu zutsu onegai shimasu. So, now over here he is using this word toriaizu. What does toriaizu mean? First and foremost, kocha to lemon tea, futatsu zutsu. Please 2 each, because there are 4 of them. So, 2 each, onegai shimasu. He could have also used o kudasai. That would also be correct, but generally the phrase or the word used is onegai shimasu, that please get this for me, it is a request. And o kudasai would just say please give it to me, a very, very direct request. So, because you do not know the waiter, so well onegai shimasu. And wakarimashita we did in our last lesson only with shirimashita or shitte imasu. So, can you use this over here? No, you cannot, because teinin has understood now what they want, and he says sugu omochi shimasu. I will get it as quickly as possible. I will get it immediately. Now, after 2 or 3 minutes he comes back again, kocha to lemon tea o dozo, and please remember that the intonation is rising because he has got the things that you wanted. So, he is putting it in front of the people. Now, go chumon wa okimari desu ka? Again you will see chumon is order that you would make at the restaurant, and go is honorific again, like in go jusho, go jusho. So, again go is honorific over here. So, here also you can see go jusho, because again it is teinin and Rao-san, they are customers. So, he needs to be very polite. O kimari desu ka? Again there is o over here. So, the waiter is being very, very polite. So, o kimari desu ka? Kimari is have you decided? Now, again Rao-san is also being very polite. So, Rao-san puts another question and he is saying o susume. Susume is what do you recommend? So, what is special at your restaurant? So, teinin says kyou no special menu wa chicken curry to ebi pasta desu. He can also use ni over here, which means in today's special menu chicken curry and ebi pasta is there. So, you already know. So, the next part is ja ebi pasta mitsu to chicken curry hitotsu onegai shimasu. Mitsu is 3 and hitotsu is 1. Rao-san asks the teinin, kare ni rice wa suitemasu ne? So, intonation is rising. He could have said mas ka, but he uses ne. Thus, because you are not putting a question mark, the intonation is rising with particle ne. Kare ni rice wa suitemasu ka? Meaning, is it there with rice? Kashikomarimashita. So, over here this is another typical phrase that the waiter is going to use. I have understood, and we are going to deal with this later in our lesson. Kakunin shimasu. I will just ask and see. And what is he going to see? That if rice is there with the meal or not. So, maybe he nods his head, maybe he just could have said hi also over here, and then he continues with kakunin shimasu. So, I am going to ask you again and repeat the order. Kakunin is I will check now. So, ebi pasta mitsu to chicken curry hitotsu desu ne. That is, you have ordered 3 ebi pasta and 1 chicken curry. So, Rao-san says, so desu. Nanpun gurai kakarimasu ka? So, gurai is approximately time, how much time it is going to take. Kakarimasu means it is going to take. Kakaru is the verb, kakaru. Nanpun gurai, approximately how much time it is going to take to bring all this to us. Shosho omachi kudasai. So, you have done this also. Chotto matte kudasai. Expression polite is shosho omachi kudasai. We just did it in our previous lesson. 20 分 gurai desu. So, he asks somebody and he says 20 分 gurai desu. Rao is daijabu desu. That is all right with us. After 20 minutes, everything comes and Tenin says, omatase shimashita again. Sorry to have kept you waiting. Omatase shimashita. Chicken curry to ebi pasta mitsu. So, these are the 2 things that you had ordered. So, chicken curry to ebi pasta mitsu. Dozo go yukkuri meshiyagatte kudasai. Again you see an honorific over here. Yukkuri is slowly. So, before yukkuri go, because again he is talking to his customers. So, he says after serving, dozo go yukkuri, please enjoy your meal. Meshiyagatte kudasai. Meshi agaru. Meshi agaru means taberu. So, polite honorific for taberu is meshi agaru and kudasai is please. So, please enjoy your meal. That is what it means. Meshiyagatte kudasai. Please eat your meal. So, after eating, Rao-san says, okaike onegai shimasu. That is, please get the receipt. Again, honorific. He could have said kaike onegai shimasu, but generally okaike onegai shimasu. And Tenin says, domo arigatou gozaimashita. Mata irashite kudasai. Please come again. So, this is your kaiwa. This is all in the script. There are a few kanjis which you will be able to do. So, try to do those at home on your own. Look up the dictionary as well. Now, why I am not showing you the passage is because your listening will also improve. So, now we will do what was there in detail. Irashai I have told you, namme sama desu ka, yonin desu, kochira e dozo. So, you can see she is pointing in this direction and saying, come this way please, arigato. Now, omatase shimashita we have already done. Toriaizu is what I want to do with you first and foremost. So, before that we have mei, and mei is used for counting people and sama is polite for san. It is used generally at shops and restaurants where you need to count people, and the most common expression that is used is namme sama desu ka. The counter for people is nin. So, nan, you have done this also, nan nin desu ka. Whatever the noun over here, gakse, sensei, okasan, kodomo tachi, nan nin desu ka. Now, there was a word toriaizu in the passage and we are going to do it now. It means to begin with, in the beginning, in the meantime. So, basically what does in the meantime mean? It means that you are having a discussion and you are unable to decide what to do. So, while we are deciding, toriaizu, let us do this. It is also written in hiragana and also in kanji. And now let us see the sentences and see how it is used. So, you have this person here and he says, O nomimono wa ikaga desu ka? As was there in the conversation, and he says, Toriaizu biiru onegai shimasu. So, nani o tabemasu ka? Menu o mite kara kimemasu. After I have seen the menu, I will decide. Kimeru is decide. This conversation is between friends. So, ja toriaizu nomimono o tanomimashou. So, while we are deciding, let us first order something to drink. So, the waiter is there and A-san says, Sumimasen, toriaizu biiru o kudasai. Please get beer for us as we are still deciding. So, when you use toriaizu, then it means that something else is going to follow. This is only for the time being. Over here also you can see, kaette kara toriaizu shawa o abimasu. The first thing that I do after returning is I take a shower. So, you can see from the example that when one is not sure or is not fully decided as to what to do, then the meaning is to start with, or you could also say, let us begin somewhere, start somewhere. So, I have more sentences for you and it will be easy to understand. Toriaizu kore o yatte mimashou. For now. So, there is a discussion going on during a meeting. Someone says something, and they are not coming to a consensus. So, somebody will say, okay, toriaizu kore o yatte mimashou. Let's try this for the time being. Let's do this for the time being. Toriaizu is generally used at the beginning. So, toriaizu biiru o onegai shimasu, as you saw in the conversation. So, now toriaizu tabete kara ha o migaite kudasai. So, maybe you are at the viewing at the hospital and the doctor is telling you about taking care of your teeth. So, toriaizu tabete kara ha o migaite kudasai. So, after you have eaten, please, the first thing that you need to do is to brush your teeth. First thing. Then, toriaizu happyo no junbi o shita hou ga ii. So, you are preparing for your ronbun happyo, you are busy, but you also have other things on your mind. So, your friend probably says, forget everything, toriaizu happyo no junbi o shita hou ga ii. That see where to put your laptop, how to connect it, whether the PowerPoint is all right or not, is there any mistake, everybody is coming. So, before thinking about other things, please concentrate on fixing your happyo, how you are going to present it. Now, this is a different usage of toriaizu. Your boss is telling you to do something, your teacher is telling you to do something, you are not very confident, but they are insisting, or you yourself want to do it. So, you perform that action, you do whatever is asked of you and probably are unable to do it well. So, then what do you say? Toriaizu yatta kedo yoku dekina katta. Well, I tried my best, I did what I could, but maybe could not do it well. Toriaizu yatta kedo. There are times when you try very hard, you are not sure, but still you try and then you feel okay, maybe I could have done better. Toriaizu, first and foremost. So, tried meaning is also there over here, or something is very difficult, but you want to try it and see. So, toriaizu yatte mimasu. It's a little difficult, muzukashi kedo toriaizu yatte mimasu. So, toriaizu can be used in different ways. Now, there was another word zutsu in the conversation, and zutsu means each or each time or little by little, gradually. So it's a suffix and is used for counting, for measuring something. There is this picture where you have roses, you have lily and again roses all over, and this is a flower shop. You go over there and what do you say? Kore to, kore. Ippon, one stem. Ippon, zutsu, one each. Onegai shimasu. Pon is the counter for long cylindrical objects. So this is a long stem. So well, ippon zutsu onegai shimasu. One each. Now you can see from here as well. Kanojo wa ippon bara no hana to ippon yuri no hana o kuremashita. Kuremashita is written over here. For space I just used kureta, which is same in meaning, but this is more informal and this is normal mass form. So kanojo wa ippon, one bara no hana to and one yuri no hana o kureta. Now kureta I am going to do later also, so concentrate on this part at the moment. Kureta means to give. We have done it with agemasu, watashi wa agemasu, watashi wa moraimasu, and someone kuremasu, to me. So that is humble. So we will do it in detail later. At the moment over here. So how will you use zutsu? Kanojo wa watashi ni, to me. Bara to yuri no hana o ippon zutsu, one each, kuremashita or kureta. Kanojo is girlfriend, so kureta is used. She gave it to me. Now you can also show division with zutsu. Minna koko ni tatte kudasai. Please stand over here. A gumi koko ni tatte kudasai. B gumi koko ni tatte kudasai. So A gumi is A group over here and B group over here. This you already know. So minasan A gumi to B gumi ni wakarete kudasai. Please divide into two groups, A group and B group. Now how will you use zutsu? Minasan, 5 人 zutsu, 5 each. 5 人 zutsu no, 5 each no, A group to B group ni wakarete kudasai. So please divide into A group and B group of 5 each. Is it all right? So this is how you will use zutsu, basically meaning each. Now to show little by little how will you do that, gradually, slowly. So keki o tsukuru toki, when you are making cake, kona wa skoshi zutsu irete kudasai. Please put flour very very slowly, little by little. You did this kanji also, skoshi over here like this. So skoshi zutsu irete kudasai. Another one, kona o neru toki, when you are kneading dough, when you are mixing flour and making dough out of it. So kona o neru toki, mizu wa skoshi zutsu, little by little ireta hoga ii. So if you add lot of water in flour, it's going to become very loose. So you want exact correct consistency. Then mainichi goko zutsu, 5 each. Goko zutsu. Kanji o benkyou shimashou. Let's study 5 kanjis every day. And ko you did in your previous lecture. So counting irregular objects. So 5 kanjis every day. Or mainichi goko zutsu kanji o benkyou shita hoga ii. It would be better if you study or read or learn 5 kanjis every day. Another one over here, mainichi 10 ko zutsu, 10 each. Nihongo no atarashii tango o oboete kudasai. Please learn 10 Japanese words, new Japanese words every day. Tango is vocabulary. Now, today the conversation is a little long. Kocha to remon tea o dozo. Please have. Gochumon wa okimari desu ka? I already told you. Mada desu. So, we will just do this. Osusume wa, what do you recommend? Kyou no special menu ni chicken curry to ebi pasta desu. So desu ka? Or so ka? Ja, ebi pasta 3つお願いします。そして、彼女はエビ食べないので、チキンカレー1つお願いします。She is not going to have, so please give 1つチキンカレー。カレーにライスはついてますね。カレーにライス。This is a typical way with カレー basically meaning is with. With カレー we have rice, isn't it? Rice is complementary or rice is there with カレー。はい、そうです。So he says that's correct. So now you can see Gochumon onegai shimasu. So he comes over here and asks him, what is your order? Please can I take your order? Or he could say, Nomimono wa ikaga desu ka? He doesn't know what he's going to order, whether food or just something to drink. So he can also say, the waiter can also say, Nomimono wa ikaga desu ka? Ikaga is do, as I told you earlier. Now, there was a word mada. How will you use mada in sentences? Mada means not yet, and it can be used with verbs and nouns both. So, let us see. Sensei wa class ni modorimashita ka? Has sensei returned to the class? So, he was there, he went out, and now is he back? Iie mada desu means not yet, or mada kite nai. He has not come as yet. So, who is saying this? Gakusei. Because they are in class and only then they can say kite nai. Another one is there, very, very informal between Haha and Mira, that is Okasan and Mira. Mira, oni-san wa doko? Heya ni iru. He is in the room. Nani o shiteiru no? So, with no intonation is rising. And very, very informal at home conversation. Nani o shiteiru no? What is he doing? So, she says, Oni-san wa mada nete iru yo. He is still sleeping. Oni-san, she could remove from here and just say, Mada neteru yo. He is still sleeping. So, yo over here, this particle, it's a sentence ending particle and is used generally with people younger to you or in very, very informal situations. So, over here mother and daughter are talking, so she can say yo. Yo you will not use with your seniors, please keep that in mind. Then we have two madas over here, mada mada. So, what is that? Nihongo ga jouzu desu ne. Somebody says jouzu desu ne to you. You of course will not say, yeah, I am very good at it. So, if you are Japanese and as you are learning Japanese now, so even if you are very good at it, you will say, iie mada mada desu, I am still learning. So, Japanese are very, very humble and polite. Now, there is another one here, kashikomarimashita. We are going to do this right away. I have already done all the explanation. We will do kakunin shimasu over here very, very quickly. So, you can see over here she is writing and checking the order, and over here she is asking what this is. So, whatever I have ordered, is it this thing? And the waitress says, yes, that is what it is. Then, omatase shimashita. So, when you get the order, generally that is the phrase that you will use with your okyaku-san. Omatase shimashita. Sorry to have kept you waiting. Now, there was this word kashikomarimashita. as I said, at restaurants in formal situations, generally the Japanese use honorifics. Honorific expressions to people who are older in age, in rank. So, generally polite expressions are used. You just saw O being used and go being used before certain words. Now, kashikomarimashita, as it is pronounced, is actually polite for wakarimashita. We did it last time also with shitteimasu. So, kashikomarimashita is polite for wakarimashita, I have understood. So, now look at this one. Sumimasen, Todai Akamon made onegai shimasu. So, please take me till the red gate, which is very, very famous, of Todai, which is Tokyo University. Kashikomarimashita. So, this thing is happening where? In a taxi. So, the driver says kashikomarimashita, I have understood, I have to take you there. But then he says michi wakarimasu ka? Do you know the route? So, hai, massugu itte kudasai. 2番目の交差点から右に曲がってください. So, massugu is straight, itte kudasai, please go straight. 2番目, the second 交差点, which is crossing, kara, from there, 右に曲がってください. Please turn towards your right. So, kashikomarimashita, I have understood. Now, there was another word here, sugu, and sugu means right away, immediately. Sugu yarimasu. So, somebody tells you, sumimasen, chotto kore yatte kudasai. Ah, wakarimashita. Sugu yarimasu. I will do it right away. Then, eki wa sugu chikaku ni arimasu. So, in your previous conversation where the taxi man says kashikomarimashita and the lady says kosaten kara migi ni magatte kudasai. Sugu soko ni arimasu. Immediately over there you will see the wherever she wants to go. It's right there. Then mo sugu rokuji ni narimasu. Very soon it's going to be 6 o'clock. And also sugu yatta hoga ii. It's better that you do it immediately. So, different ways of using sugu, and some places it means immediately, some places it means I will do it now, some places right away, more emphatically, and there are other ways also which we will do in our later lessons. Now, there are some kanjis for you which I want to do. There is this kanji you have done which means ue, up, and this is 3 over here and like this. This is te, meaning hand. So, when you join the two, what does it become? Jozu. You have an upper hand at something. So, jozu. Jozu means good at or skilled at something. Also, this kanji means to go up, agaru, to go up, ageru and agaru. Also, it has another meaning which means to give, agete kudasai, ageru. Then there are similar looking kanjis over here. This is up, you have done ue, and this kanji you have done in doyobi. Another reading is tsuchi, which is soil. So, very similar, up and tsuchi. Over here you can see, don't confuse. Then we just now did te, this has 3 and this one is, tell me you have done this one, sen. So, this has 3 lines and this has 2 lines in horizontal over here. Just see, this is te and this is sen. And then there is another one here, because we did this migi ni magatte kudasai. So, this is migi, and this kanji similar to migi is ishi. The difference is over here. So, this part is not there. Once again for you, this one and this one over here, migi and ishi. Now, I have a kotowaza for you with ishi, which I am not going to do today. I am going to do in our next lesson. You can look up the net and see, and it is a very famous kotowaza. Now, just to revise very quickly, irashaimase, welcome, kochira e dozo, please come this way, gochumon onegai shimasu, please give me your order, omatase shimashita, sorry to have kept you waiting, kakunin shimasu, I will just repeat once again, check again, kashikomarimashita, polite for wakarimashita, dozo go yukkuri, please enjoy, go slowly also it means, and mata irashite kudasai, please come again. Now, there is vocabulary here. I will just read it out aloud for you to get the pronunciation. Ageru, kaike, kaike is receipt, get the bill. Irashaimase, slightly rising intonation. Then meshiagaru, and as I told you, meshiagaru is polite for taberu. And then okyaku-san you already know, mise no hito, teinin, then kakunin suru is to check once again, chumon, order, kochira over here, polite for koko, then toriaizu, we did in detail, sugu also we did in detail, machimasu is a verb, you know, harau is again verb in dictionary form, machimasu is matsu, then susume is recommend, kimaru, something gets decided, kimeru is to decide, and yukkuri is slowly or gradually. So, with this I would like to finish our class today. There are a lot of new words, lot of new things, new expressions, restaurant expressions, what you should say, how you should respond to them, what the waiter is expected to say to you or to the customer. You have learned today, and I hope when you go to Japan you will feel more comfortable. And as you all watch animation, so you will hear a lot of this some point or other. So, till our next class, arigatou gozaimashita. Mata aimashou.